Hi, everyone. Don Davis here, and welcome to Supply Chain Secrets. I'm just starting us off at the top, giving a little recap of the show today. And on this show, we had Eric Johnson from the JOC, and he's from the technology sector of TPM, and it was really a great show. He gave us a little bit about his background, some thoughts on what has happened over the last 2 years, what sectors he sees as evolving quickly. We talked about what different modes can innovate the best with technology that's available. And then we talked a little bit about the ocean sector specifically and what does he see, how does he see it, what does he see evolving and happening there. We talked a lot about the current investment that you're seeing in the industry. There's quite a bit of venture capital money right now floating in the industry. And you put on top of that the carriers making a lot of money. Where's that money going to go, and where does he see things being invested? And we talked about areas of impact, where he's seeing the most impact from a technology standpoint. And then finally, we talked about TPM Tech, which is the JOC's new event. They're bolting it on to JOC a couple days before, and what to expect from that. And then finally, Eric got to ask us podcasters some tough questions and get our thoughts on a few things. So I think you're going to really like the show. Don't forget, rate us, review us, give us your feedback, and we'd love to hear from you. So enjoy the show.
You are now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast with Bryan Most and Don Davis.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Bryan Most, SVP Retail Strategy at NYSHEX and former VP of Supply Chain at Walmart.
And I'm Don Davis. I'm the Senior Vice President of Carrier Strategy here at NYSHEX and former executive of Hapag-Lloyd and CMA CGM.
And we're back again with our podcast, Supply Chain Secrets. Hope everybody's doing well out there, and it's great to be back with you today. Don, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, having a lot of fun. Thanksgiving is close to us when we're recording this, so looking forward to that.
Absolutely, and I know you're just as excited as I am about our special guest. We've got Mr. Eric Johnson with us today. He's the JOC Senior Editor for Technology, Maritime, and Trade, where he covers lead coverage on analysis and technology's impact of global logistics and international trade. Eric regularly reports on how shippers and carriers across all modes of logistics companies use software, as well as new concepts impacting core freight transportation processes. Prior to joining JOC, Eric spent 13 years with American Shipper in a variety of roles, most recently covering logistics technology. Eric, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Bryan and Don. Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Well, hey, look. I shared a bit about your brief background, but it's always fun and interesting for our listeners to hear how somebody like you made it into the maritime industry. So would you share a little bit about your journey?
Sure. Like most of us, I dreamed as a small boy of one day being in logistics. No, it's not anything that happened. Initially I wanted to be a basketball player and stopped growing about sophomore year of high school. So that was out the window. So I figured I needed to probably figure out what I wanted to do with my life. So writing always came really naturally. That kind of took me on a path toward reporting and working for newspapers, which took me on a winding path toward getting a job in Long Beach for the local newspaper covering the ports of LA and Long Beach. So knew absolutely nothing about them on my first day on the job other than, literally, I didn't even know what a ship-to-shore crane was. I didn't know. I vaguely knew they existed and that there was some stuff that went on there, but it was literally starting from scratch. So thrown in at the deep end. This was 2003, so right in between. If for those of you who remember, well, let's see, it wasn't a lockout. Was it a lock? Yeah, it was a lockout in 2002 at the ports there. It wasn't a strike. Yeah. It was a lockout. And then 2004 was that year of crazy congestion based on a whole bunch of factors. I think the rails were backing up. I think the terminals were not running at peak efficiency. And so I was right in between there. And then there was ILWU at that point was also expanding their roles. And so there was this big push to join the ILWU at that point. So it was trial by fire for sure, figuring out, the ground underneath me as I was trying to run on it. And yeah, literally it was like from the first month I was covering it, I was like, okay, there's something here. And then a couple years later, got contacted by American Shipper to join be their West Coast reporter. And yeah, it seems crazy now that it's almost 2 decades, but it also I wouldn't have done anything else. It's been awesome every step of the way.
Yeah, I can imagine though, when you said you started coverage for the ports in Long Beach. I think prior to that, it probably wasn't that exciting, right? There weren't that as many things happening, and then you like joined at this time where there was just like chaos after chaos, event after event. That had to be pretty cool to be like, oh wow, before this it wasn't that interesting, and now there's this big explosion.
Well, it's funny you say that because I didn't really even have much of a frame of reference. I didn't really talk to the reporter who I replaced all that much. '01 is when China was sort of came into the WTO, and that set in motion this huge influx of imports from China. The ports were going gangbusters that whole decade until the financial crisis. And so I didn't really have any sort of frame of reference. Actually, I think what I found is over my career, now that we're almost, again, sad to say, 20 years of doing this, is you sort of piece together that frame of reference more than coming in with it and getting it right away. So a lot of things that you come across now and that conversations I have with various parties, I now have the historical reference that I wouldn't have had even back then, really. So,
yeah,
but
I think
it's been crazy ever since I joined the industry, for sure.
So it's somehow linked to you, I think, that all this craziness has happened, maybe.
You can attribute the excitement to me. I'm more than happy to take credit for that.
I think we all feel better now that we have someone to blame. But no, I'm just kidding. But no, I think that's interesting, and I think that there's been so much change in the industry. I think particularly you look over the last 2 years, there's been so much change, and I think people that are new to the industry, they're like, oh my God, what happened to this? Like, I thought this was like some stable and calm industry, and things have really changed. And can you talk about like your experience having been at the JOC and the past 2 years and how things have changed in the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some sense, so I cover technology, right? So in a certain sense, I'm kind of dealing with that every day and have been long before I joined the JOC. I mean, I've been covering the technology side of it for about a decade now, and I'm always talking about kind of this impending change that appears to be on the horizon, but is never quite fully realized, seemingly. And I think my world has sort of collided with the sort of traditional physical world of logistics really hard the last year and a half, right? Like the things that we couldn't do without, or we could do without prior to the pandemic, you realize, our ability to buy online, our ability to work remotely, our ability to coordinate with people instantly across the globe, all of that stuff came into really stark relief over the last year and a half. And what the industry is really good at is kind of papering over inefficiencies through just problem solving, hard work, just kind of gumption, for lack of a better word. And that doesn't always work in the situation that we're seeing right now. So, I mean, I started at the JOC about 2018. It was post-Hanjin, relatively quiet couple years as I eased into my role at the JOC. And then, as soon as COVID hit, it's just been like, it feels like it's just been one unending year. So it's exciting, but I think everybody feels like they might need a little bit of a vacation at this point, or at some point, it's a lot. Everyone I talk to, no one's in panic mode, but everyone is in kind of, I could use a break kind of mode.
Eric, we're sitting here talking, those of us that have been in the industry for a while, and we can recount some of the major disruptions, whether they be around labor negotiations or weather events or bankruptcies or what have you. They would typically run their course after a few months. Everyone would kind of go back to normal and forget about it, so to speak, right? Kind of this industry grit that you talked about. We'd all pull together, we'd get through it, and then we just go back to the same old way of working. And that way, and then when the same event happened, we were right back in the same predicament. And I just wonder, now that this is prolonged, and I think some are even accepting that maybe there is a new normal, is this the kind of like seismic event that has to happen for people to finally say, okay, I have to embrace a new way of doing it, whether it is through technology, whether it is through process? Do you think we're at that point where people are finally accepting that?
That's a great question. I haven't really thought about it in that frame of reference before. The problem is the industry is so diverse, right? There's so many different types of entities, even within the same quote unquote category of stakeholders, right? Like if you just say shippers, well, shippers are not monolithic, right? You take the same person and put them at two different organizations, they're going to it's the sliding doors thing. They're going to take totally different paths based on like who they work with and what the company philosophy around how important supply chain is and whether they get to buy things or they have to, beg their CFO to, buy it. And so it's really hard for me to say that even an event as disruptive as this is like, it's hard for me to generalize across the entire industry and say this is the point at which everything changed. I think what we will see is, especially as it relates to containerized supply chains, is in January of 2020, the delta between a supply chain that was exceptionally well run and super sophisticated and very data based and one that was mediocre to not so great, kind of flying by the seat of their pants, it was there, but it wasn't really wide because ocean freight was cheap for everybody and transit times were, like different, but within a tight band. Those things have exploded. Both of those things have exploded to such an extent that I think it separates the really high performing supply chains from the mediocre and lower performing supply chains that much more. And that's where I think you'll see companies, whether it's process, whether it's an exceptional group of talented people who just know how to get stuff done, or whether it's, some sort of automation or data element that helps them get ahead. That's where you'll see. So you may have a company whose transportation costs have gone up and they need to carry more inventory, but they're performing so much better than their peers, and it's noticeably better than their peers this year and going into next year. So I think that's maybe where you'll see that kind of come to light. And then maybe a year from now, when they have those supply chains set up that are that much better than their competitors, the competitors are going to hit that light bulb might go off for them at that point.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting because this market condition, I think it really exposes your flaws as companies, because there's just this tsunami of things that are happening, whether it's congestion at the ports or there's COVID outbreaks or there's ships stuck in the Suez Canal. And there's all these supply chain issues that if you're not running and manage things tightly, it just becomes exposed because, these things weren't problems, as you say, like 3 years ago. And today they've been problems for about a year and a half. But when you look across the supply chain, there's different modes. There's truck, there's rail, there's ocean. Do you point to one area that you feel like there's the most opportunity for technology to evolve there? Or do you look at that all the same way, or how do you see it?
That's also a good question. I used to survey people about this, like what was the most problematic mode and what was the mode with most potential. It always seemed like the modes that used to get a lot of attention were the ones where there was the least amount of data or the least amount of kind of visibility into. So rail, drayage, inside the terminal, those types of things. I don't know things have changed a lot now. I have a innate bias toward ocean. I just find it the most interesting part. That's where I got my start. So I gravitate toward solutions that are oriented around ocean. Obviously we all know the percentage of global volume that moves by ocean. So it's so important. So, I naturally gravitate toward the things where we move the needle a little bit on ocean, I guess, more than the others. But, there's so much going on in last mile. There's so much going on in first mile. Actually, I think is probably an area that deserves a lot more attention. Like, just look at what's gone on in China in the last few months, in Vietnam, where you've had factory closures and, certain origin transportation providers are knocked out of service for a few weeks. Like, that insight into that, and not just relying necessarily on a forwarder to manage that and have it be behind a curtain, I think is very interesting. So yeah, I guess that area is what I might focus on rather than a mode by mode. Like, everybody's strategy is so blended now, right? Like, you can't just be like, we just do ocean. It's pretty rare that I see someone go, we just do ocean or air, and nothing else, and not the other, right? Like, everybody has to consider everything at this point. So it's all blended.
So that makes sense, and I appreciate that. So if we're going to zoom in on ocean and say, like, here's a opportunity for technology to evolve, how do you think ocean's been evolving? A lot of people, Bryan and I have been in the industry for a long time, and I've heard people say that our industry is in the Stone Age. We're like there's a lot of paper, felt very manual, and you just didn't see a lot of tech. And do you have a sense of like how that's been evolving, particularly when you look at the, let's say, the last 2 or 3 years compared to the prior 10?
I use this as a reference point for myself a lot. When I first went to American Shipper in 2005, one of the first things I did was I reported on that first year. I was reporting on the portals, the booking portals, Intra, CargoSmart, GT Nexus, right? That's where you turned, right? At that point. And, I was writing about them sort of from this perspective of these things are probably going to be pretty important, and yet a lot of people remain skeptical about it, right? And that was 5-6 years after they had been introduced. And so that's my frame of reference for how long it can take for something that's obviously a much more efficient way to do something to actually get critical mass in ocean. I think there's still a natural tendency to kind of like hang on to what you do. But I think that time span between product introduction and like enough adoption to move the needle has shrunk a bit, right? It may not be 6 months, but it's maybe 2 to 3 years instead of 5 to 6 years. And I'm just throwing numbers out there, but that's like a gut instinct. And part of it is there's so many companies. So there's just this flood of salespeople pitching all sorts of different solutions, which can be confusing for the market, but it also means the market is just sort of constantly considering things now, as opposed to occasionally considering them at an industry conference or, when they get pinged once a quarter. And then, from the carrier point of view, there's a lot of unevenness about how much technology they're adopting that's actually modern versus what's kind of old. I just found out a couple of days ago that one of the major container lines is using a container management system that's literally like 23 years old, something like that. So to track their container assets, right? So it's this, kind of weird mix, this weird soup of like really on the cutting edge stuff to, Outlook and Teams to really old stuff that should have been retired a long time ago, but for whatever reason hasn't.
Eric,
it's moving faster. The cycles are moving faster.
Yeah, but it's really interesting to your point about, this whole, thing of all this soup together and all these different types of technologies. But there's this ton of interest, and you start to see quite a bit of money, right, coming in where these opportunities exist. You talked about some of the early booking portals, etc., but it seems like there's more venture capital money or private equity, purchases that you start to see in the headlines across the supply chain. I just wonder what your take is, where you see areas being targeted or where you see this money being directed and, what you think maybe that they're trying to solve by doing it.
There's a lot of money, and the last 15 months especially, every industry that VC has kind of cast their gaze upon is getting gobs of money, like crazy money in some cases. And I don't mean crazy. It's not my role to say whether it's crazy good or crazy bad, right? It's a lot of money, right? Objectively, there's a breadth of number of systems that are being funded that is interesting to think about. Not just that there is a lot of money going in, but there are a lot of individual companies that are getting funded. So you have to think about it from that dimension. That the areas that it's being funneled toward primarily I see are visibility, obviously. That's probably number one. Digital forwarding, obviously, if not number of investments, the largest tranche of investments has definitely gone into this kind of digital forwarding model. Automation, process automation is definitely a growing bucket. I've said this before, but I think one of the things that's interesting, if you kind of step back from whether any of these companies are great or whether any of them are worth the money that's being put into them or the valuations attached to them, is the aggregate benefit of what's gone on the last decade is that you have a whole bunch of insanely smart people who've gravitated toward the global logistics industry that would have gone to fintech or insurtech or health tech or some other tech, right? And they've been drawn in, and they're in. And as we all know, once you're in, it's like the mob. You can't go, you can't leave. They don't let you leave. So I think that's a benefit that we will start to tangibly see over the next decade, because you'll see a bunch of second and third generation founders start to emerge, and their ideas will be sharper because they will have gone through not just developing some sort of technology, but they will understand the industry a lot better than they did at that first company that they joined.
I love that point, that just the influx of people, right? You see people that typically haven't been in this industry, and now you see this influx because there's this venture capital influence and people putting money into things. I think the other thing that's happening is you see the carriers also achieving these record profits, 12, $16 billion a year. And the fact that there's now money in this industry, I think it's very beneficial, and it lends to like ideas and investment versus, historically the industry was faced with a lot of cost pressure, and now that you have this return, you can invest. So when you look at these categories of like visibility, digital freight forwarding, automation, do you point to one to say that you can see it's made the most impact? Or is it still too early to judge the impact of some of this investment and some of the things that have come into the industry?
You guys are asking tough questions today. This is something I ought to be asking. I ought to be stepping back and asking myself, probably, right? Because I write about this stuff, and sometimes you lose the forest for the trees. So I don't know. My actual answer is I don't know, because visibility is more in demand than it's ever been. It's gotten gobs of money across not just, kind of one or two players that have, raised probably the most amount, but a lot of other startups that are kind of, especially a few that are focused purely on ocean. But, that was what they are aiming for is the same thing that GT Nexus was aiming for in 2006, right? Like talking about turning the lights on global supply chains and one source of the truth, and that underlying data being the thing that you could build your entire supply chain around. And so to a certain degree, it's kind of like we need all this money, and we still need all these companies, and we're still having to explain this. Like, shouldn't we have already have achieved this by now? And maybe it turns out that this congestion crisis is the catalyst for people saying, no, this is not it. It's not even a want to have, it's a absolutely must have. I mean, forget a need to have. It's a I can't do without this or I will be left in the dust kind of thing. The other models, I think automation. So this is a very roundabout way of saying, I actually think automation, I said this at the beginning of 21, that I felt like automation was going to have the biggest impact on the market over time. And it was probably the thing that was going to happen with the least amount of fanfare and the least kind of consciousness of the market, because things are already built upon certain aspects being automated. Data entry, what if scenarios being run in the background that make a decision maker feel like they are choosing the right thing when it's actually the system prompted them to choose the right thing, right? So all that stuff is being kind of infused in the background, and people in some cases don't even realize it. And that's, I think, more impactful than I'm going to go and buy this solution, or I'm going to work with this digitally enabled provider because I'm into digital transformation. That's probably my answer is the automation side.
No, and I think it's a great point, and I'd love to just dive a little bit further on automation, because you talked earlier about at some point, like this physical world of moving, steel and containers, and the digital world that kind of accompanies it have to come together at some point. And so we've talked about the investment on the technology side. Now recently you're seeing big investments being made in like physical infrastructure. And do you think automation kind of plays a part in helping bring those two together? Because there are some that would argue that, hey, the ports are great, they just need to be able to improve their velocity and move through what the existing infrastructure is, and then they'd be able to keep up. I just wonder if you think that's the point where maybe the two come together, or something else.
Well, I think before we get to automation, we need some sort of, if not standards that everybody agrees to, because that's pretty pie in the sky with the number of entities that we're talking about, but some sort of layer that creates essentially a common meeting point for everybody. Because before you automate, you can't have 10 different formats of a data. You can't call a facility 10 different things and then automate that without a bunch of cleansing of that data, right? So there needs to be some standardization, and the question is who kind of pulls that together. Is it a private entity? Is it an independent nonprofit entity? Is it a port? Does it help if LA does it and Long Beach does it and Savannah does it differently? And Norfolk does it differently. And so there's just it's such a problematic thing to try to corral all the different entities who all have different needs and motivations for what they care about and what they want to invest in and what sort of standard they would need to adhere to. I don't necessarily think automation is the thing that automatically bridges the digital and the physical world, but getting each individual entity more digitized would be a start, because then that sort of common layer could help bridge that gap. But we're nowhere near that, right? Like, I mean, every entity is at a very different stage of digitization. So down the line, yes, but right now you can't just say, I'm going to put in an RPA solution to make an arrival notice that a carrier issues match the arrival notice that I get from my visibility provider, right? When they're could be at this point 2 weeks apart, right? So I think we just have a long way. So there's no magic bullets. It's just a lot of hard work.
Yeah, I agree, and that's a great assessment, and I appreciate that insight. And look, we've been peppering you with tough questions, and I know Bryan is always asking the tough questions. Guests always talk about it. So, but I have one more question, and then we're going to turn around to you to ask us questions. So feel free to fire away. And remember, Bryan's the one asking the tough questions. But the one thing that's coming up, and I think a lot of people have it circled on their calendar, is TPM. And this year or next year, we have this TPM Tech event. And can you talk a little bit about that event and what people can expect from that event this year or next year?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Would love to. So for those of you who have followed kind of the events that JOC has put on the last few years, we did an event in Las Vegas for a couple of years called LogTech. And that was in 18 and 19 in fall. And then in 2020, we were supposed to do a brand new kind of event within an event at TPM called El Dorado. You can kind of think of TPM Tech as a Frankenstein of those two events, the ones that we actually did have and the one that we had to cancel, in that this is a conference that's meant to really go deep instead of wide. It's meant to go deep on a range of issues in global logistics technology that I don't see being discussed a lot, right? So get more granular than I'm allowed to get at TPM, and also more forward thinking. So one way I've been trying to help people understand what exactly TPM Tech is relative to TPM is about the next 12 months. What are my rates going to look like? What is capacity going to look like? What's the macro environment look like? Who do I need to meet to make my operations over the next 12 months better? I view TPM Tech as where is the industry going to be in 2 to 5 years, and how is technology enabling that? So that's kind of the bigger picture. Is we're not going to get into the operational issues that are happening right now as much as how do I completely either transform or goose up some process that's plaguing me right now, and what will that look like, over time? So, but it's great. I mean, it's going to be a smaller event. It's more intimate, but highly concentrated cross section of people who are really fascinated or inundated with tech right now. That's their job and that's all they care about. So it's actually, I mean, LogTech was a really fun event because you had a diverse set of people with a very homogenous view of how important technology was to this industry. And that's what we're hoping to achieve at TPM Tech. But 2 days or 1 day away from TPM, so we're hoping there's a lot of people that flow over from the TPM tent into the TPM Tech tent as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I think the good news is that your friends at NYSHEX will be there in force, so we're really looking forward to that, and should be exciting. So thanks, and we're prepared to go deep. So that's going to be awesome. So now we're at a point of the show where Eric, I mean, sometimes paybacks are tough, and you get to ask us some questions. So is there anything you want to ask two old shipping guys who are working at a startup?
One thing I'm very curious about, I'm actually right in the midst of putting something together on this that's quite, by definition, speculative, because I can't get inside the heads of each of the individual sets of carriers. But what do you think the carriers, and you can be as, you don't have to be specific, but just we can kind of branch them into groups. What do you think they're going to spend these historic profits on? I've compared 2021 to a rich uncle that you didn't even know existed dying and bequeathing all of his fortune to you, and how that might change your financial outlook and what you might decide the rest of your life might look like, right? I feel like this is almost a life-changing event for these carriers, some of them especially. So how do you think they are going to deploy all this cash?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I mean, I think it's first of all, a great problem for the carriers to have, because for a long time, they never had this kind of issue. They're just wondering, how am I going to get through this next year? So the fact that they have billions at their disposal is like a little bit like winning the lottery almost. Like, oh my God, I went from famine to feast in a second, it seems. But in all seriousness, you see some activity. You saw CMA CGM acquire a terminal. You saw Maersk acquire another forwarder. It wouldn't surprise me if you see that type of behavior, that you see certain types of long-term strategic investments which can pay dividends in the future. My sense is that carriers don't necessarily expect this to last forever. I mean, it's conceivable that it could, but I don't think anyone's going to, go on this wild spending spree just assuming that I'm in an environment where I'm going to make 12 to 16 billion every year. I think most carriers are going to be fairly conservative, because there are some cost headwinds out there, particularly when you point to the environment, that, it's in order to be compliant as a carrier, it's going to be difficult and costly. And if you're talking about acquiring new vessels for your fleet, that of course is an expensive investment. And there's some, debate over, is it LNG? Is there some other type of fuel that's going to be compliant with IMO regulations? So I think there's a lot of things out there which gives the carrier some pause. But I do expect investment in technology and things that can help them create efficiency, because I think one thing you see from the carriers is that they absolutely want to provide a better product for their customers. And there's some frustration over the fact that, their reliability isn't great. So they want to try and do things to fix that. Now, is it, one purchase or one investment that's going to do that? Well, no, but I think they're preparing to do things so that over the long run, you're going to see improvements, because I think that's something they know they need to happen. But I also think that as these results continue, if they continue for a longer period of time, then you're probably going to see some carriers start to get more aggressive with their spending.
The one thing I would tell you too is I think the carriers have this incredible opportunity. They finally have rates at a profitable level. I think all customers want is they want to get what they're paying for. Right? So if somehow, some way through these investments, the carriers can offer this reliability, Don, that you're talking to, the predictability that they need for their supply chain, and actually create, a set of offerings that, again, as a shipper, you can choose whether it's first class, whether it's economy, or whether it's the back of the bus, it doesn't matter. But whatever you pay for, it gets delivered upon. I think the carriers have an amazing opportunity to actually get customers to continue to pay profitable rates as long as they get back what's expected. And so whether it's the investment in assets, whether it's the investment in technology, or again, the combination of the two that deliver on the promise, I think whoever those carriers are, those will be the ones, in my personal opinion, that will win in the future. They'll certainly separate themselves.
Interesting. On the fuel issue, I think is super interesting, because you have different carriers, but kind of taking bets on different alternative fuels too, right? So there's not even uniformity in terms of what they might invest in right now. So, which creates a really uncertain picture of how that looks, right? Like there could be some expensive things happening right now that don't end up being viable long-term. So yeah, that's I think my sense is there's going to be a rainy day fund set aside for what they will need to invest in on that side of things.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the past too, you had the IMO 2020, right? And there was this whole debate over low sulfur fuel versus scrubbers. And, those that bet on just buying the low sulfur fuel were the winners, because the fuel price dropped, and you can't predict that. And that's just, an unfortunate side effect of the pandemic, is that if you went out and got scrubbers, well, you didn't really need to do that, because the fuel price was roundabout what it would have been if you still had the more sulfur fuel. So that's, I think, something where it gives carriers pause. I think you've seen some carriers try and change some of their ships to be LNG, and that has been very expensive, and they're like, I don't know if that's the way forward. So to that point, I think carriers have to be conservative, because running an ocean carrier business is very expensive. It's asset driven, ships are expensive, containers are expensive, fuel costs, you consume a lot of fuel. this is something that's changing. So I think there's a good reason for them to have some pause and really give thought of what does the future look like. It's unclear right now.
Yep, maybe you don't let a journalist just free reign to ask questions. This is a total wrong move there. But this is what I specialize in. I'm curious for your opinion. And, you asked a question that sort of made me generalize across the industry, and now I'm going to flip that back on you. And I know there's no way to do this, but I'm going to ask it in a general way. Do you think there's a point at which rates stay high, transit times stay really long, that fundamentally, if it already hasn't happened, that fundamentally changes the nature of what's imported from Asia versus what, if not reshored, gets changed, sourcing changes to somewhere in the Americas or in Europe for that destination? Do you think there's a fundamental change in supply chains based on what's happened in the past year, or did the economics, once the rates kind of normalize, swing right back into?
I mean, I'll take this question first. I think Bryan might be more of an expert on this, but my sense is just basing it off of what you saw when there's this whole Trump dispute with China and all these tariffs, and you saw a bit of a shift from China to Southeast Asia and maybe some places like Turkey and things like that. But what you saw is that it wasn't just so easy to flip a switch and start sourcing somewhere else. I think if that type of effort would really take some time, and I think it would take really years, because I think there aren't too many places that are as equipped as China to have the kind of production they have. So I think in small increments, you can see it change. But when I was at CMA CGM, we looked at this and we really saw that Southeast Asia, exploded in a relative sense. But it was still dwarfed by China because they still produced so much more than everybody else. So I thought you saw a change, but how long is it going to take for a structural change that China is less significant and maybe it's like South America or Mediterranean? I think it's going to take a long time.
Yeah, I'd agree, Don. I think it's going to take a while. The numbers are just so big. You certainly are starting to see some companies now look at nearshoring and making some investments. I think that it's a whole host of things they'll look at, right? The value of the goods. Is it high value good, low value good? Is it complex or difficult to make? What kind of investments would need to be made in factory or facilities to make it happen? What kind of labor force would you need? Now, if there are some kind of incentives that come out of this to do more of that here in the U.S., potentially, but to Don's point, I think that the numbers are so large from an import perspective, it'd be hard to make a dent anytime soon.
Yeah, I think the market swings back enough to trivialize some of the concerns in a shorter period of time than it would take to reorient complete supply chains. So I tend to agree.
Well, Eric, I really appreciate your questions, and I think it was a great show. We really enjoyed having you on. Thanks so much for your engagement, your questions, and putting up with Bryan and I. I know we asked some tough questions, but it was really great having you on.
Oh, it was great to be. Great questions. All of them made me stop and think for a second instead of just blather on like I normally do. So I really appreciate the time with you guys.
Yeah, sure. And maybe after TPM Tech sometime we can have another have you on the pod again and kind of break that down and talk about the future. That'd be really cool.
That'd be great. Would be happy to come back anytime.
Awesome.
Thanks, Eric.
Well, to our listeners, thanks a lot for listening. And don't forget, wherever you find our podcast, Apple, Spotify, any of those locations, rate us, review us, give us feedback, because we love hearing from you and we love making changes that our listeners want to see. So thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast network.